All right, I think we can go ahead and get started. Again, I'm Susie Kamin. I'm from OrgVitality. And first of all, I hope that you're all enjoying the conference so far. As we go through the presentation today, I wanted to just kind of cover a couple housekeeping tips. Um, First of all, don't worry about taking notes. The slides will be sent to all participants, and a recording will also be available on our website. And given that we only have around 30 minutes, there's not going to be a lot of time for any question and answer at the end, but please feel free to submit any comments or questions in the Q&A section on Zoom, or you can send me an email. With those housekeeping items out of the way, I want to thank you for coming today for my overview of some of the barriers that exist when it comes to open feedback within organizations. All right. Okay. As a brief introduction, my name is Susie Kamen, and I am a consultant here at OrgVitality. I've been with the company for a little over 2 years now. I have a PhD in industrial organizational psychology. At OV, I work on a variety of projects related to things like surveys, 360s, competency modeling, and other similar projects. Again, if you have any questions or comments about my presentation today or just would like to talk further, here's my email address on this page. And as the title of the webinar suggests, today's discussion will focus on some of the barriers to open feedback in organizations. I'm going to emphasize the voice of the employee and how we can enable a better flow of information upward in an organization. To provide a bit of a roadmap, here's an overview of the general topics I'm going to be touching on. To begin, I'm going to provide a very brief overview of discussion about the various forms of communication in organizations. And after this brief intro, I'll discuss some of the barriers that can get in the way of the effective flow of information, as well as some of the ways that we can encourage more open and candid feedback. And finally, I'm going to discuss some of the ways that we can approach surveys or other upward communication processes to help facilitate better and more open dialogue. So when we think about communication, the first thing that usually comes to mind is the emphasis that organizations place on the downward flow of information from senior leadership down through the organization. And I'm sure you're all familiar with the countless articles and books out there that are focused on improving communication. And these books and articles are usually concerned with helping executives and managers to improve their style and technique. And no doubt, companies devote a great deal of time crafting their communications and using a lot of different methods to try to reach people. But when thinking about communication organizations, it's important to recognize that the flow of information is very multifaceted and complex. And truly effective and healthy organizations ensure that they have very clear and open channels of communication that utilize not only this downward flow of information, but also facilitate the communication between employees and the sharing of information upward in the organization as well. When thinking about communication in an organization, I like to think of it really as a cycle. It's much like a conversation between two people. There's a give and a take, and the extent to which this information is free flowing, both up and down and across, it provides a strategic benefit. And as you can see in this chart, there's just a couple of the various methods or channels that organizations can use to communicate, such as town halls and memos or handbooks, and some of the efforts that organizations use to open up channels to hear the voice of the employee upward through things like surveys and suggestion boxes or team meetings. So with any communication, we're all very aware that there's a lot of barriers that can get in the way. First of all, one of the biggest impediments is noise. There's almost always some noise in the system. It can be defined as anything that interferes with the transmission of a message. These can be things like poor reception on your phone or a bad Wi-Fi connection, or people mumbling or speaking too quickly. Noise like this can also be compounded by the sheer volume of information that we're bombarded with on a daily basis. There are studies out there where research have tried to quantify the amount of information that people are exposed to. And in fact, at the University of California in San Diego, they did a study which estimated that roughly 34 gigabytes of information are reaching our eyes and our ears every day. And people can't possibly process this much information. And it shows that our messages really face a lot of competition in order to attract and hold people's attention. Add to that the time pressure that many feel, it's not surprising that getting a message across is challenging. Um, and another issue that gets in the way of effective communication is how people can interpret messages differently. It's most obvious when we think about working in a global environment where there could be translation differences or cultural differences. But even when we're speaking the same language, people can interpret things differently. Our own biases can come into play and we can interpret things differently, or add the fact that many people can receive mixed messages from different people and hear competing voices. So it's not surprising that communication can get muddied and complicated. And then you add into the organizational complexity where there can be multiple levels. And like the game of telephone, sometimes these messages get filtered and distorted or embellished or even missed altogether as the information flows through the different levels. And finally, we often have very poor retention for information or messages, particularly if we don't devote a great deal of attention to what was being communicated. So we've all had that experience where just because you send an email, it doesn't mean that anybody's going to read it or much less open it. And so I kind of think about it how when I'm communicating with my own kids, I find that oftentimes my messages need to be repeated or reinforced multiple times before they're really heard or really adopted. So even with the impediments that barriers that are inherent in our communication, it's important to take a moment and reflect on, well, yeah, given all this, why is it still important to try to open up these different channels? And improving the flow of information upward in an organization really allows senior leaders to have greater visibility into the eyes and the ears of their employees. These are often the people who are frontline to customers or have better insights into the customer needs and wants. And they're also more likely to have insights about things that aren't going well, that things that are inefficient, where there are frustrations, and even where there may be potential violations or dangerous situations. Employees throughout the organization can often be a valuable resource also for new ideas and innovations. For example, the idea for Post-it notes at 3M came from an employee. And similarly, the Frappuccino at Starbucks was first suggested by some store employees. So when when people feel that their voice is heard, it can be a highly rewarding and motivating thing. People want to be part of a solution and feel that their ideas are valued and listened to, and sometimes even implemented. It makes them feel really part of a greater team. But when the methods for sharing information upward in an organization are broken or inefficient, the downsides can lead to a range of negative consequences, such as frustration or low morale, people not working as hard and putting forth decreased effort, absenteeism, and even turnover. And in the most dangerous situations, the lack of employees' voices can lead to things like accidents or even scandals. We're all familiar with some of the big name scandals such as Enron, or when we think about what happened at the University of Michigan and the gymnastics scandal. A lot of people tried to raise concerns, but the concerns were repeatedly dismissed until the situation became publicly known, and then it was very damaging to the company's reputation. When we think about these breakdowns in the upward flow of communication, we can think about it as having roots in three different sources: the employee, the managers that they're interacting with, as well as the organization itself. In the following slides, I'm going to kind of break this down into these different sources of these barriers to the effective feedback. So when we think about the employee and how they may be playing a role in the sharing of information, there are two different ways that they may be limiting their information through the organization. First of all, sometimes they are distorting the information that they're sharing. And other times they may want to withhold information and just stay silent. When we think about when people distort information, we can also think about this as both being sometimes intentional in nature, as well as some unintentional distortions that can occur. There are times when people may distort their message because they want to only share the information that supports their pet projects to show that it's more supported. They might not share everything and they're limiting, so they're distorting the full message. Sometimes people may also delete information in order to gain some sense of power. As we all know the saying, knowledge is king. And sometimes having more information or more knowledge and not sharing the full picture is a form of distortion. Some also may feel inclined to fudge the data or distort their messages to avoid accountability or responsibility if something goes wrong. Um, but and sometimes also people want to distort what they think may be for positive reasons. They're distorting because they want to be optimistic and they want to be positive and provide a rosy or flattering feedback. But this is still possibly not as open or as truthful as it could be. And yes, there are these times when people may deliberately distort things, but I'd like to believe, and I believe it's true, that most of the time people do have good intentions and try to do their best. For example, as information moves through an organization, there are times where people try to share the right information, but it's misinterpreted as it's moving through the different channels. Like I said before, this game of telephone can occur where information is distorted as it moves from one person to the next. And you compound this with time pressures and stress, which can lead to inadvertent mistakes, which can make distortions in the information. Or stress, we're often likely not to take the time to make sure that our message is clear or that the recipient really understood what we thought they did. And we often will make judgments or share our opinions quickly and without considering all the information we should. Perhaps we haven't just taken the time we need to consider others' perspectives or to fully explore the facts. If we did, our ideas may be quite different. You compound this with some emotionally charged topics or situation, can lead to even greater distortions or embellishments of how we really feel about a situation. So there are also a lot of reasons why people may just choose to stay silent or withhold their feedback. People may be wary of sharing their opinions. I imagine that several of these statements here may feel familiar to you, or you can empathize with people who have experienced these feelings. Generally, people are going to withhold their feedback because of a variety of different reasons, but some of them are they don't want to make others or themselves look bad. If they know somebody spent a lot of time on something, they don't want to shoot it down or embarrass anybody. Or they might want to keep quiet because they don't want to look like they're a negative or they're difficult or they're stupid or don't know what they're doing or are uninformed. They also believe that for them to get ahead in the job, they have to always support their boss and just provide that rosy perspective. And so, I don't want to say anything bad, so I'm just not going to say anything. And others may not share because they're cynical. Maybe they've been shot down a lot in the past, or they've even heard how others' ideas are dismissed or ignored, and they figure, well, why bother? It's not going to do anything. Why should I change? Why should I share? And also, many may avoid giving feedback because it could lead to them, getting more work. I don't know if you've also had the situation where you've said, well, I think I do it a little differently. And hey, all of a sudden that project is now yours. Also, it could lead to even more negative situations where speaking up may lead to maybe some undesirable work assignments where a manager may retaliate a little bit or perhaps even impact performance evaluations. So a frequent conclusion seems to be, when in doubt, keep your mouth shut. And as we move on to the manager and organizational barriers to upward communication, it's important to recognize that most of these barriers or behaviors are also not intentional. Companies and managers often have very good intentions and may not always recognize when they're acting in ways that are inhibiting communication. For example, most managers will say that they have an open door policy, but sometimes their behavior doesn't really show this. They may say that they value feedback, but when faced with demands and pressures of their job, they may become defensive if their ideas are criticized, or they may ask for ideas and then shoot them down, or avoid feedback for fear that it will make things even more complicated. Some managers also have a tendency to micromanage or are maybe highly critical, and which can make people feel more uncomfortable with sharing their ideas, feeling that, well, it's not going to be welcomed or valued. And Rarely, managers can also be openly hostile about suggestions, kind of shooting the messenger or taking things out on the bearer of bad news. With respect to organizational barriers, sometimes there are limited or ineffective methods that exist for sharing feedback. Maybe people don't know how to raise the information. They don't know what channel would be most effective, or there may not be a channel that they feel comfortable using. Alternatively, some organizations are slow in responding to feedback or in sharing the results that they hear. Obviously, sometimes more pressing issues can take precedence, and sometimes that sharing and acknowledging feedback can fall to the background. But to employees, it may seem as though their feedback was just ignored or dismissed. And then finally, there also can be things like cultural factors. Like in some cultures, there may be a sense that leaders behave kind of like parents, where, hey, don't you guys worry. We're the parents. We'll take care of things. We'll do all the important stuff. You just do your job and we'll handle the rest. And consequently, the employees might limit themselves and say, oh, well, it's not my job. I'm not going to say anything. I'll just go over here. I'll do what I'm asked to do. And I'm sure they'll let me know if I need to do anything else. And then we also know that legends or the corporate stories can play an impact in limiting upward flow of information. If people have heard stories of retaliation or negative consequences, it can be a powerful impediment. Even for those who don't experience it directly, hearing about how others have been treated can make others feel that they too should be kept silent. Okay. So how do we handle this? Because when it comes down to it, a key reason for silence is often the perception that employees have little power in relations to others. But that's significantly reduced when employees see their managers as being genuinely open to feedback. So, how can we break down these barriers? What are some techniques or some ideas to use? And one of them is to think about how you're doing manager development. It's important to also give managers the skills that to solicit and actually listen to feedback and to see the value of an open culture. We tend to think about giving managers training on how to give feedback, but it's important for them to also receive training on how to receive feedback. Giving them the tools to be more effective at things like active listening, and how to encourage employees to open up if they have a concern or an idea, and helping them learn how to listen without judgment and to ask big, open-ended questions to get more clarification. These things can create a safer place for employees to share their views. It's also good for to support the encouragement of feedback and to truly welcome it and to help managers see this. When they say that their door is open, they really need to mean it. They need to take the time to allow people to express themselves and to focus really on what their concerns and issues are. It's hard for managers sometimes, but they should be seeing feedback as more of a gift. It can be seen as threatening, but if employees see that their manager and the company are open to ideas and criticisms, they're going to be more comfortable continuing to share their perspectives. It's also a good idea to make a habit of seeking out feedback. Good leaders make a habit of asking things like, what do you think? How would you do this differently? And how can we have a greater impact? It's a good idea to choose a set of questions and start asking them and build a habit of going around and asking these. Another way to build in the habit of feedback is to encourage managers to structure their meetings in a way that builds in time for feedback or ideas. Consider starting regular exercises where employees discuss, like, what should we keep doing, what should we stop doing, and what should we start doing. Another thing to think about is, how do we train employees on being openly candid, and how do we model this of giving effective feedback? We talked about how people may not be comfortable speaking up, and when in doubt, they're going to stay quiet. So many employees are often unfamiliar with how to provide feedback in a constructive way. They may not be speaking up just because they don't quite know how to. It's a good idea to model effective ways of giving feedback and coaching people on how to do it properly. And also, it's a good idea to open up multiple channels for communication. Different employees are going to have different comfort levels with expressing themselves. Having multiple channels to communicate allows them to communicate in the way that best fits them. Giving them lots of option to speak up through different defined processes, make sure that you're letting them know that their voices will be heard and that their opinions matter. It's a good idea to also follow up with people to let them know that they were heard. Obviously, you don't want to break confidentiality concerns, but it's important to acknowledge what was heard and what was shared and to thank people for their time and effort in providing feedback. And you may even want to think about ways to reward employees for criticism. There may be creative ways to reward them for speaking up and showing appreciation for constructive criticism or kind of problem solving thinking. And always remember to give credit to people when you use their ideas, when it influences your thinking, or like, I thought about what you said and I want to give Jerry credit for this. I thought it was a great idea. And then another thing that's really helpful from a more of an organizational standpoint too is to gather stories in which maybe an initial idea or approach was flawed, but was corrected by somebody else. And these kind of failure stories can help establish some credibility and dedication to learning and changing. If leaders are comfortable sharing times when they may have been wrong and they publicly praise the employee who showed them the error of their ways, it can go a long way in showing people the value of feedback. So, when thinking a little more concretely about a survey or a 360 or another upward feedback program, there are also some additional ways that we can encourage more open feedback. Um, People are going to be more than perfectly honest in your survey if they've been burned in the past, and they may be afraid of the consequences of telling the truth. And your challenge is to make the survey feel as safe as possible. And by taking steps to build trust, you'll nudge them closer and closer to an environment where they feel that they can truly be honest and open in their feedback. So the first thing you want to make sure you do is give employees a reason to respond. Explain why taking the time to fill it out will be worthwhile. How will it benefit or impact the way that they work? And second one is to make sure you honor the confidentiality. Most surveys include safeguards for confidentiality, such as a minimum number of responses to see results, but you need to definitely honor the spirit of this confidentiality as well. I've heard stories of executives directly asking people in a meeting, how did you respond to the survey? I know at least a few of you in the room were negative because of the way that the results came in. And while this may have been done in the spirit of transparency and trying to really open up the dialogue, it really made the people in the room uncomfortable and the story filtered through the organization. Another thing to do is to describe in detail what's going to happen with the results. Anytime you ask somebody for feedback, it creates an expectation that something's going to be done with it. When nothing is done, it sends the message that perhaps the feedback wasn't valued. When you launch your survey, you should communicate a roadmap to employees about how the information will be used and when they can expect to see changes. And follow through on your promises. If you make a commitment to act on the results, do it. And this is how you're going to build trust. Another thing that you want to think about is preparing your managers. Sometimes getting survey results to a manager can feel a little bit like getting a grade from their team, and sometimes that can feel uncomfortable or perhaps even threatening. It's important to prepare and equip them with the tools they need to respond appropriately. Providing them with templates and scripts or tools to how to respond to feedback and how to create follow-up plans with their teams can be really useful. And also providing them with some insights on the mistakes to avoid and why. Another thing you may want to be wary of is linking your survey scores to any outcomes like performance reviews or compensation. This really raises the stakes of the survey for people, and it can lead to managers starting to pressure people in different ways. Like, well, if we get some bad results, it's going to have consequences here. Or, people suddenly a few weeks before the survey goes live, there's suddenly a pizza party or some changes in the behavior that aren't really authentic. Another thing is to not overemphasize response rates. We all know that a good response rate is a good idea to help ensure that you're getting a full picture of an organization's how they're feeling about things. But there are instances where organizations sometimes push too hard to get employees to respond. And how accurate or meaningful is this feedback if it's been coerced? When we actually see exceptionally high response rates, it can sometimes be a red flag that people may have been pressured to respond. And then the last thing on this page is to share your changes, share what you've done. When changes are implemented, make sure you tie it back to the survey so people can see that the change was a result of their feedback. Make sure that you make that connection. Okay. So previously, I mentioned also that I think of communication at an organization as similar to a conversation between individuals, and the survey is similar in that way. A survey is really a start of a conversation, and the questions that you ask really tell the employees what the organization values or what they're concerned about. And as the quote from Einstein on the left shows, it's important to carefully craft your items to make sure that you can tackle issues that come up most effectively. It's important to take the time to make sure you're asking really well developed questions that are concise and clear. And if you find that you have words like either and neither and nor, it's a good chance that your questions may be getting too complicated. You also want to make sure that you're avoiding things like double barreled items that include more than one issue, like asking, to what extent was the stretch assignment and the training program effective in helping you in your professional development? Well, what if the training was great, but the stretch assignment wasn't? How is the respondent supposed to answer? Or how are you supposed to interpret that on the tail end? And another thing is to phrase your open ended questions thoughtfully. It's common to have a couple of questions, one that may ask, like, what's going well and what's something that needs to change or improve? You might want to consider ways that you can provide more direction. At OV, we like to include a nudge for respondents to let them know what a useful comment looks like. Another consideration when crafting your survey is to think about ways to get below the surface, especially when asking about sensitive topics. It's a good idea to try to dig a little into the extent to which people feel safe in raising concerns. A good indicator is to ask questions such as, how confident are you that you'd be treated fairly if you raised a concern? Or, can you raise issues without fear of retaliation? In addition, it can be useful to ask people about how confident they are that things will change as a result of the survey. This can provide insights into how responsive people believe their manager or team or the organization is to feedback. And asking these questions related to trust and openness and responsiveness can really help uncover some cultural issues that may be impacting your upward flow of communication. So I mentioned just recently about how we use nudges at OV. So this is another thing I think that is useful incorporating into your surveys or other feedback gathering methods. At OV, we believe that most people really do have good intentions, and nudges can be a way to help people live up to these good intentions. Now, if you aren't familiar with the concept of a nudge, it basically can be described as a simple method to help reduce cognitive load and to help make it easier for people to make these good choices. When I think about a lot of the recommendations that I've been discussing, many are things that people intend to do, but with the demands of their job or life in general, they're sometimes not fully implemented or embraced. So it's maybe useful to incorporate some nudges. Some ideas of things that can be useful include framing. Framing is making a positive choice more obvious and available. I previously mentioned how we use nudges to frame a comment section on surveys. In the instructions, we outline the elements of what a useful comment is and provide space for them to provide this type of information. Alternatively, you could provide a frame for managers to know how to effectively share results of their survey, or how to provide good examples for creating an action plan, or how to structure meetings to gain more input. Another idea is to think of using social pressure in a way. You play on people's social desirability, where often in surveys we'll send out reminders that include a subtle social pressure, such as, hey, over 50% of people in your company have responded to the survey. Make sure your voice is heard too. And finally, it's a great idea to include some well-timed reminders that can be impactful. Things like reminding managers of their own intentions or commitments to taking action, reminding people to get out and visit their team to ask for ideas or suggestions, or reminding them to show appreciation to thank people when they do share. But one thing to keep in mind is that at their core, nudges really should be very simple. Now, opening up communication and listening to employees is always important, but it seems to be even more important today given the pandemic crisis. It's impacted virtually everyone in some way or another. As we all navigate these new ways of doing work, we want to be keeping in mind and listen to how people are really feeling. They're likely to be having fear and uncertainty. There's a lot of changes in their perspectives and priorities. And there's a lot of new expectations that employees may have as they as they come back into the workplace. And some people are feeling a range of emotions, such as a sense of gratitude or frustration and anger. Um, it's a great opportunity for right now to connect with employees and to begin a conversation. So in light of this, we at OV, we're ready to help. We currently offer a free pulse survey to organizations to help gauge employee reactions to your organization's response to the current crisis. And this is another opportunity where you can open up the channel of communication. Now, we have hit the 30-minute mark, and I want to encourage you to join in our sessions tomorrow on other topics that we have related to things like artificial intelligence and privacy legislation and framing your survey. But in the meantime, please feel free to reach out with any questions or comments, and I'll be sure to respond. And as we end, there will be a quick survey about this session. We welcome your feedback. And again, thank you very much for your time.